So we just did a little quick introduction about the sorts of questions that prompt the thinking that we're going to talk about tonight. And I'd like to just sort of outline the objectives for the class, which will be to explore and to discuss the nature of evil and different approaches to the concept, including biblical and theological approaches, the types of evil, one very specific type of evil called paradigmatic evil, and then I'd like to explore and discuss different approaches to the Odyssey, which we'll define in just a few minutes. But basically, what questions are we trying to answer, and what ways have traditionally been offered to answer the question, and are there other possible approaches to these questions? I will say, as I was telling Amanda, we will not be providing definitive answers to any of these questions in this class because they don't exist. Right? These questions have been debated since the dawn of man and woman, and so we don't expect to resolve the questions tonight. But I think it is an interesting topic and can be very thought-provoking. So I hope this to be an interactive kind of session, so if you at any point want to interrupt me and ask a question, if I know the answer, I'm happy to answer it, or it may become the subject of discussion for the class. So feel free. So let's just start by talking about what evil is. Despite the fact that we hear the term evil a lot, we see it in books, we see it on television, we talk about the concept of evil generally, there is no consensus definition of what evil is. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. Sort of colloquially, in sort of the normal way that we speak, it is associated with sort of severest forms of immorality or wickedness. On the other hand, evil has been defined by some people as just purely suffering without any sort of moral cause or moral consequence. So you have differing sort of views about how to define evil. Philosophy, theology, and a whole other host of disciplines have their own definitions. So to sort of get us just started in our discussion tonight, I wanted to just ask the group if any of you would be comfortable offering your definition or what you think of when you think of evil.
I generally am implying that there's motivation.
Okay. All right.
I think.
Okay. All right. So intent to do harm or something like that. Yes. Yep.
Cruelty without any empathy.
Okay. Yeah. I think these are all both good definitions. Is evil a term, and this is sort of a cheeky question, but is evil a term that you hear in the Episcopal Church a lot?
The Lord's Prayer.
Yeah, so in the prayers, right, for sure.
But then I feel it's not, I don't think it's so popular, I think, where we shy away from like overt labels of things and judgments, like not as comfortable labeling it, well, that's evil, and that's, I don't think it's in our culture as
Okay,
much.
yeah, I think that, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Generally, in terms of societal evils. That's right up here.
Yeah. I don't hear it a lot outside the prayers or or other aspects of the liturgy.
Baptismal covenant.
Yeah, that sort of
Here, like
liturgical.
vague evils, but not, like
Right.
liturgical evils, not specifics.
Right. Okay, that's right. Okay, great.
I've always struggled with people who think of evil as just plain suffering. Like there's, to me, to say, if someone gets ill or there's no treatment or they're in great pain, I don't think that is evil. I think it is suffering.
Yeah. I think there would be many scholars who would agree with you that is not, that to disassociate it with some sort of cause, malevolent cause, would not be evil. But on the other hand, some are want to get away from associating with morality altogether. And so they just paint a very broad definition of evil to include any form of human suffering. Or not even human suffering, but suffering of the earth or suffering of whatever, animals, things of this nature. So you'd be in good company, I think, Susan, is what I'm saying.
How about a malevolent action or condition? Condition would take in suffering. Action would take in
Yeah. Something that's done.
intent.
Yeah. That's right.
I like that. The evil implies an intent of some sort. It's
Yeah.
not just, it doesn't just
a vague out there.
Yeah.
There's intention.
These are all perfectly suitable definitions. So we want to cover, or I want to cover, just a few sort of biblical depictions of evil. If we went through the Bible and reviewed how the term evil is used in various settings, what we might see. Probably the first we would see is that evil as chaos. So this is the notion that that chaos threatens the ordered creation, God's ordered creation, and which was very prevalent sort of in the ancient Near East at the time that the earliest books of the Bible would have been written. This notion of sort of destructive, evil monsters and things of this nature would have been a prevalent theme. You see this in the Bible in the first Genesis account, where God sort of takes control of the chaos and brings the world out of it. And you see it in Job, in which God is said to have tamed the creatures Behemoth and Leviathan. And so it just is sort of associated with a lack of a disordering of the world and the suffering that arises from it. Probably the most common, obviously, depiction of evil in the Bible is as sin. Broadly speaking, what we mean here is disobedience against divine law. So, which would affect a rupture between God and humanity. It begins right away in the Bible almost with Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and then continues immediately into chapter 4 of Genesis with Cain's murder of Abel. Now, what is the law? That's a pretty broad question, but typically in this context we're talking about the Ten Commandments or the covenant between God and the Israelites, things of that nature. Evil as sin obviously moves into the New Testament period. Jesus himself calls for repentance. Paul speaks a lot about the works of the flesh versus the works of the Spirit. So this notion of disobeying God, sin in that sense, is a very common depiction of evil in the Bible. And then we have the depiction of evil as the demonic, and this is symbolized typically by the devil or Satan or some other malevolent being. This appears in the biblical texts, or is referred to sort of obliquely in the biblical texts, when the devil is said to have been an angel who was cast out of heaven. This appears in Isaiah chapter 14. And then these beings, when they come to earth, they work to disrupt God's creation. They work to torment human beings. And then in the New Testament, we see Jesus being tempted by Satan in the desert, and Satan being referred to commonly as the ruler of demons and the ruler of the world. And of course, Satan is ultimately vanquished by death, the death and resurrection of Christ. So this is probably, this is a biblical depiction of evil that we may or may not ourselves hold. We're getting beyond maybe into some of the areas in which we may or may not, think of demons when we conceive of evil. Some of us might, but it is certainly a biblical concept. And then evil as suffering. Back to Susan's question. This is probably most famously depicted in Job itself, where Job undergoes, just a litany of different forms of suffering, including the death of his children and physical illnesses and the loss of his wealth, loss of his health generally. And then, the Psalms talk about suffering, just the suffering that goes along in life, that there are going to be good times and bad times. And this, I've quoted Psalm 90 here as a reference to, basically life is toil and trouble. So the notion of evil as suffering, yeah.
So I've never heard Job presented as a question around evil. I've heard it presented as a question around suffering and how does God allow suffering. But evil's, the question's in there, is it?
Yeah. So this is, I think, how we get the sort of the connection between evil and suffering, sort of on its own, almost in its own category. I think, and it doesn't hurt that in the book of Job, the figure of the Satan, right, the Satan appears as this sort of malevolent figure who is sort of given charge over Job by God in the story, right? So I think that's where the sort of more malevolent notion comes in. Yeah, surely.
So he had an evil plan, whereas, I mean, to me, when you first asked what is evil, I almost thought it was anything that works against God's good plan. But, you know, the devil definitely had an evil plan in going after Job, to try to show that his obedience and worship were just because he'd been so blessed.
Yeah, that it was conditional, right?
Yeah.
That he could be broken, as it were. Is the story there for sure. Okay, and here's just a sampling, because I'm a seminarian and we talk about theological concepts, and this is what we do. It's just some of the perspectives of notable theological figures in our history. Interesting, I know we've just had a series of classes, I don't know if it was on Wednesday night or Sunday morning, on Augustine. But Augustine had very specific notions about evil. He denied that it existed in and of itself. There was no substance to evil. It was solely what he called a privation of the good. And it was, creation was innately good when it was made, but then human choices are what ultimately corrupted it, bringing in sin. Similarly, Thomas Aquinas said that evil is nothing, which is sort of a negation, and not created by God. Similarly, it is sin that corrupts creation and does not belong to God's created goodness. And John Calvin just said evil was sin, sort of disobedience, point blank. But Calvin is different than Augustine and Aquinas in that he says that God does not author evil, but he ordains it, because it is necessary to Calvin's theology, right? There has to be some moral depravity. There has to be evil has to come into the equation somewhere. And so for Calvin, he didn't want to quite say that God created evil, but he tacitly allowed it, I guess is the best way to put it. And then here we just wanted to talk about, this is again more on the academic side, this is how folks who work in this area, theodicists, theologians, philosophers, will talk about the different types of evil. And there's a little controversy even in this. I think we've heard a little bit of sort of hints of it. But moral evil is evil generally that human beings inflict on each other, or they inflict on creation, or they inflict on animals, or they inflict on whatever. It's evil done by people. Natural evil is pain, suffering, and destruction that originates from natural events. So here, this is a notion of evil that is not tied to a particular moral cause. But, the Southeast Asia tsunami, which killed 250,000 people, that sort of notion by some people would be categorized as evil. Metaphysical evil is the hardest of these to kind of describe. It's the basic notion that the universe is out of balance in some way, but that allows for other forms of evil to occur. I mean, it can also refer to dark spiritual forces like Satan. Okay. What's interesting is I think some people have already sort of highlighted too, the link between moral and natural evil. It can blur. So if a person develops cancer, which they contract from pollution, which has been intentionally released, by a company or by a person, or even recklessly released by a person, that can be moral. That can sort of transition into moral evil. Or, the increasing ferocity of hurricanes because of, human contributions to climate change. That's, again, we're blurring the line between moral and natural evil. So it's not they're not necessarily clean boundaries in every case. And then paradigmatic evil is just the kind of evil that is so atrocious that it brings into relief, it brings the question of what is evil fully into our consciousness, such that we think, okay, what is going on here, right? It's sort of beyond the everyday evil. It's that causes you to stop and think, why does this sort of thing happen in the world, right? It's the bubonic plague or the world wars or September 11 or things of that nature. In the literature, the Holocaust is the decisive sort of instance of paradigmatic evil. But it's important to remember too that that evil events can have particular contextual sort of significance to particular communities. If you're living in a small community on a small island and your entire island is wiped out by say a terrorist group or even a hurricane or whatever, that's going to be significant for your group, and so it could be paradigmatic for a small group or for even a small nation or whatever. It's not necessarily the size or the scope of it, but the impact, the way in which it brings the act permanently into the awareness as something to sort of think about, as sort of a mile marker, if you will, in that group or nation's history. Okay, so we've talked about sort of some of the common definitions in the literature about evil and concepts of evil. Now we want to pose the problem of evil specifically, which is in philosophy and in theology often framed in this way. If God is good, God would prevent evil. If God is omnipotent, God would be able to prevent evil. Evil exists. Therefore, either God does not exist, God is not good, God is not omnipotent, or there must be some sufficient moral reason for God to have created or allow evil. So this is the question, sort of the philosophical question that is posed by all of these events. Something has to give in these three concepts, or there has to be some other outweighing moral reason for God to allow evil to exist. Put another way, how can a loving and all-powerful God and evil coexist? I'm just curious, before we launch into considering some of the concepts, if you all have things on the top of your head about why you think evil and how God and evil can coexist.
I saw a really great comic online
Okay.
where he was exploring the question of theodicy.
Uh-huh.
And he said, God is a three-legged stool.
Uh-huh.
And one leg is omniscient, all-powerful. Another leg is all-knowing. And another leg is all-loving. And there's a ball on top that says theodicy. And we're like humans reaching for it. And the only way to reach it is for a leg to get shortened.
That's a good analogy. That's a very good analogy.
Very clever.
It's very descriptive. Yeah.
But I think there's some equivalency that I could argue with, say, like assuming that God is all powerful, all knowing, is one way of thinking about God, but there are assumptions there that are made.
Yeah.
So if you didn't have those assumptions, that God is all powerful, all knowing, all loving.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. And so one of the things you see is that there are some people who are very committed to this notion of theodicy as a philosophical question, right? They're wrapped up in these three factors, and they're trying to get their head around it. But then you see other theories where people are saying, maybe God isn't omnipotent, right? And that's one way of dealing with it, is just to concede that God isn't omnipotent. And we'll see some of that as we move forward into the theories of theodicy. But yeah, I totally agree. Nancy.
I think, this is my fantasy, I guess. I think it was so important to our Creator, God, that we have free will, that He's willing to take the chance of evil showing its nasty head.
Yeah, and I don't appreciate you stealing my thunder either, because we'll talk about that in just a minute. But no, yeah, absolutely. That's one of the rationales we're going to see as we move forward, is that very question. It's a very astute question, Nancy. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know if omnipotent means immortal or whatever. That doesn't mean that that's what God created.
That's true.
So if God creates, God may not be able to create an immortal and omnipotent world. So God creates a world, but it doesn't have the same exact qualities as that spirit does.
Yeah.
Or maybe
It's very similar to what.
Yeah.
Or maybe our definition of omnipotent is not God's definition.
Another good point.
Of
Right.
omnipotent.
Right. All of these are human constructions, right? All of these concepts are human constructions. And so one possible answer to this question is, this is beyond, we try to think of it in terms of our emotional, intellectual sort of complex. Maybe our emotional, intellectual complex can't comprehend how God thinks and acts. Yes, Susan.
I have heard an interview, I think it was with James Cone.
Could be.
James Cone, yeah. And the interviewer asked him about this whole theodicy question and why do good people suffer and all that stuff? And his response for me, he said, the only people who ask that question or can ask that question are people who are at the top of society and think that they shouldn't suffer. I was like, all right,
Yeah.
Like,
Well, we do
who gets
see,
to ask that question? Now, those of us who are privileged
right.
enough to think,
There are some,
why should I suffer?
yeah, for sure. There are some critics who say this is a very Western notion, that people, only from the relative prosperity of the West could where people are not targeted as whole. I mean, we have, destructive acts here, of course, but people are not targeted in the same way for mass violence in the United States, leaving aside, some obvious social problems we have. But that they might be in some other regions of the world. No, that's the critique I've read for sure. Yeah.
Mark,
Yes,
what
ma'am.
is theodicy?
Can you just wait a minute?
Totally will.
You and Nancy, I'm telling you, there's a couple in every crowd.
Get a B if you
No, Nancy and I.
We're trying to throw out one thing in that, but I just thought of it. I mean, we don't think about why do animals and creatures suffer, do we?
Some people would.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but in general, it's not is it a theological question?
For the
Typically, that
Hindus,
comes
don't
up.
they worship?
I mean, for us, Christians,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Right, well, I think some people would say that if a human being acts in such a way to create suffering for an animal or
Yeah,
ecosystem,
that's
that
evil.
might be evil.
But the natural suffering that goes on in the animal kingdom is not necessarily discussed that much, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it might be considered, under some definitions, it might, depending on what it is, it might be considered natural evil. But
Right.
but you get it as some. I mean, you're making a good point, which is that you're getting into some tricky issues where a carnivore, one carnivore kills another animal to eat.
Yeah.
Is that evil? They're killing. They're suffering.
Circle of life.
Right. They're suffering. Something's going to have to suffer. I mean, something's going to die to be eaten.
Right.
Right. So yeah, I mean, those are the thorny questions.
But then at the same time, I think there is this promise of this future paradise, and specifically says like the lion will lie down with the lamb, and
Yep.
so it's pictured as there is an option to not have that suffering. So then
Yeah.
it ends up bringing the question like, oh, well then is that
Right.
a suffering that should not be in a perfect creation of God's
Right.
world?
Some of the theories, that's a very prevalent part of it, is that suffering can exist in life because in the eschaton, at the end, everything is going to be made right and no one is going to suffer anymore. Right. That is another one of the. Yeah. I mean, I don't know why you put this PowerPoint together. Y'all are doing all my work for me. So theodicy, Sarah, we can just come on up and take over. So to discuss the sort of the issue of theodicy, what is theodicy? It's not a word that we hear all the time. The word itself is a combination of two Greek words, which essentially means God trial or God judgment. Sometimes you'll hear it translated as God righteousness. This was an Enlightenment creation. And it's come, theodicy, to have one of several meanings. It is the defense of divine justice in the face of evil. It is the use of logical strategies to vindicate God from moral culpability for evil. Or it might be an attempt to just make sense of suffering in a more abstract way, not connected to any particular moral act. It attempts to answer questions about the origin, the nature, the problem of evil, the reason for evil, and the end of evil. So it's essentially, theodicy in its purest form is essentially a defense, an intellectual defense of God to justify God's goodness in the face of evil.
Okay, so it always has to do with evil.
It always has to do with evil
Okay.
for the most part. Although it is one of those fields that's changing a lot.
Okay.
But that's I think that's a good basic definition. Okay, Nancy, the free will defense is I would say of the theories that we studied in our class so far, this is probably the most commonly held theory, which is that evil exists because of the choices that human beings make. And that arises directly out of the fact that God gave human beings free choice, sort of almost as a gift. That at the beginning, creation was good, but God gave Adam and Eve, in a biblical sense, the freedom to make choices They made the wrong choices, and that is how evil sort of came into the world. So essentially, it's asserting this theory that God permits evil for the sake of freedom. In the way that we were characterizing the question a moment ago, free choice is a morally sufficient reason to permit evil. But free choice has to be meaningful, right? So for example, one of the questions that often arises when we talk about this question is, well, couldn't God create a world in which people only made good choices? If God is omnipotent, couldn't God create a world in which only good decisions were made? But is that free choice, right? So that's where that issue comes into place.
This is very Western, though. This is
Oh,
a
for
very
sure.
Eurocentric vision
For sure.
of the world.
Absolutely it
Which
is.
is why it's like, well, we're like comfortable with it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. But it does have its weaknesses. It doesn't really explain, sort of adequately explain the origin of evil. It doesn't answer the question, why would God allow evil and sin in the first place? And it also, it can result in a kind of cost-benefit analysis. When we talk about the value of freedom, does the value of freedom outweigh any amount of suffering? Right? Does it ever have a limit, this exercise of freedom? And then from a Christian theological perspective, do the, quote, sins of Adam and Eve justify the suffering of the rest of humanity that has existed ever since? So it's popular, it's used a lot. I think a lot of people hold to this particular view, but it's not without its weaknesses.
But for that second bullet, isn't that why we have laws to balance out that cost benefit?
So why does God not have laws?
He would, or God.
Well, no, but the idea of that,
I mean,
to what extent is our value of free choice to cause suffering to others? When did that stop being that freedom be of greater value than the actual evil suffering that's caused? Like, at what point, why is that the greatest of values?
Okay, yeah, that's right. At what point does one outweigh there's sort of this calculus that free choice has a lot of moral value, but is there a point where it tips, and there's so much suffering, there's so much so much depravity in the world that God would be better just to eliminate free choice, so that fewer people would suffer? It's kind of a hard question.
Well, and I think what goes through my crazy head is that some of these ways of looking at this, in my mind, put God in the position of engaging in the evil.
Yes. There are theories that would say that God is the author of evil, and we'll see when we move on in a minute to some other theodicies that some put God in a much more sort of active role in that question. So I think you're anticipating, yeah.
Maybe just, to me, the whole Job thing, if you look at it from this point of view, well, I'll just, let his entire family be like, dude, and I'll show you how good a man he is. If a human being did that, would you have a human being? I mean, come on.
Right.
We
Right.
string them up.
Right.
Same way with, well, I'll give my kids free choice and I'll see if they run on the road, and if they do, well, some of them will learn, and ones that don't get hit. I mean, if human beings do this, we would just consider them some of the most evil people.
I think you're right.
So
Yeah.
to me, this is not very helpful.
Quickly, I think Sarah's trying to, have you got another Eastern perspective?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. I know. I'll just wait for it to unfold. Okay.
Okay.
Well,
Would
that's
you-
why we value autonomy so highly. It's just interesting that for it to be a comfortable answer, you have to value free will above a lot else.
Well, the other part, which is reminding me of stories and everything else, is without evil, how do you know what is good? If there's not something to counterbalance it, if there's not evil, can we be sure what we've done is good?
So you're saying that's why evil's here?
What's the possibility?
That's what
I
was saying.
Evil is there to point out the good.
Like Adam and Eve didn't seem to know about evil.
They just wanted to know.
In your
It was
next
just
slide.
curious, I think, but
Big
you know,
like
that's another debate for another time, perhaps.
So does transcendentalism and Emerson and all those guys, and women fit under free will, like that God's the watchmaker and set it all in motion?
That's closer to what's called process theodicy, which we'll talk about in a second.
Okay.
It's a little bit different concept.
Sorry.
Complicated. It's a good one, but we'll get there in just 1 second. So another one.
He's here because he's getting a grade. He's not here because of how's this work? It's all about him, it's not all about us.
Oh, that's true. That's been true my whole life, by the
I
way.
think comparing and contrasting some of the different things might make it easier to have a conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
For sure, benefit.
Zip it up. Okay, you gotta get through it.
Yeah. All right. So another of the sort of common theodicies is what is referred to as the soul-making theodicy, which posits that pain and suffering are necessary for moral, spiritual, and intellectual
Oh, I
growth.
like that one.
But it rests on what it considers a fundamental weakness of the free will defense, which is just punishing the entire human race for the choices of two people or a few people makes sense, right? And so one of the primary authors of this notion is a theologian named John Hick, who basically said that creation unfolds in two stages. First, we are made in the image of God, and in that state we have the innate potential for relationship with God. And then later, we are made in the likeness of God, the realization of divine likeness through the proper exercise of freedom. So in this sense, suffering is not punitive, it's providential. It serves a purpose, which is to promote it, sort of encourage you to make the right decisions, which will sort of grow you, your soul, make you more pure, sort of that sort of thing. Now, any first impressions of that idea?
I hate it.
A lot of people find it repugnant, I'll be honest. But it is you hear it a lot from people when you talk to them about why does evil exist in the world? Because God's trying to teach us lessons.
But I guess it depends on how you hear that. At the beginning of, kind of going through this list, it was like, okay, I can see how situations, if I engage them in a way that welcomes God's presence in the middle of whatever that suffering is, that there can be growth and transformation that takes place even through suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But that's very different from how it ended up with, well, God just kind of lets us suffer or makes us suffer so we'll learn something from it.
Mm-hmm.
That I want to smack you upside the head. I mean, it's kind of like,
Yeah.
no.
Right. No,
So,
that's right.
That's different.
Well, there's
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
there's the other duality, statement I've heard I read in some book or something. Suffering causes some people to break. Suffering causes some people to break barriers,
Mm-hmm.
to break out,
Right.
so to speak.
Right.
And then there's Paul saying all things work together for good.
Yeah.
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 But I think historically it's been used so much, because I think there's something to finding your own meaning in suffering, but I think the problem is historically it's used so often to impose a meaning on others' suffering and to justify suffering that is not necessary.
I think that's right. So this particular theodicy has a lot of critics, and not the least of which because I think the second point here is the more germane point, which is that it downplays the destructive reality of evil. Some people, when they encounter suffering, they will grow from it. They will increase in capacity to do this or that or the other thing. Some people are utterly destroyed by suffering, and so it serves no redemptive value whatsoever. So Hick's theory fails to take account for that. Now, this gentleman who came up with this theory, he puts a lot of sort of the way around that problem in the future, right? He says, again, at the end of time, in the eschaton, when we come to the end, God is going to redeem all. So, even if people are destroyed in this life by their suffering, they will be ultimately redeemed in the. But to me, that feels sort of almost intellectually weak in a sense. I mean, it's intellectually disingenuous. It pushes it off into the future because he can't deal with it here. Yeah, it's very cold comfort if you're the one whose house just burned to the ground, or whose spouse was killed, or what have you. And then some people, like in our class, just ask the question a little bit more simply: is there a better way for God to teach these lessons than to just inflict suffering on human beings? So, but again, very common theodicy. If you just delve into it at all, you will see it as one of the most commonly talked about. Process theodicy gets a little bit more complicated from my perspective, but it's basically the notion that creation is ongoing and that God is really not omnipotent in this sense. He doesn't bear blame for evil. What God is doing is God is sort of directing human beings to the highest possible form of good, sort of nudging us along in a sense. He or she is not sort of making individual decisions, but sort of arranging the playing field so that we will make better and better and better decisions for ourselves. So in that sense, God and humanity work together to overcome evil and injustice and create more freedom and love. One of the interesting things about this theory, I think it was on the potential weaknesses, is that this turns God into a process and not a person. In this faith, we pray to a person, or at least the incarnate. We have an incarnate God, right? And we pray to a more personable deity than this. This is God, sort of as almost like the watchmaker, but not a person watchmaker. It's sort of a process watchmaker. And
It's not a very rigid,
nope.
I mean, Meister Eckhart talks about isness and everything that has isness is.
Yeah, no, right, you're right, yeah. No, it's based on a whole other sort of theology that is that sort of that nature, which is that everything is a process and moves in various directions. God is sort of moving in this direction and that direction, not just in the question of suffering, but in many different areas of life.
I like that God's in the ditch with me and pulling me out at the same time. I mean, yeah, I worship Him for that.
Yeah. Some people, I think, would not. I think some people would, but some people like the idea of an omnipotent God who can come swooping in to rescue us from our distress.
And why doesn't He do that?
Well, that's a very good question, Deacon Catherine.
What was the question?
Why doesn't He do that then?
Yeah.
Well, we did a series on evolutionary theology and spirituality.
Yeah.
And it's something like that. I feel like that, some of that, and quantum theory and so on is sort of saying, getting away from the personhood as the energy, life-giving energy.
Yeah.
But God, you cannot get outside God. God, now whether how God hears, if God doesn't have ears, or but that might be more, and it's aching and groaning. Now, would that be biblically arguable? I think you could argue. I can find myself having some biblical argument with some of this evolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of the next step from process theodicy. I think for me, in terms of theology and spirituality.
Yeah. All right. I think the next theodicy we want to talk about is cruciform theodicy, which places, that this is very Christian, which places the cross as the central symbol of divine love, and this is a love that's suffering. So the idea here is that in Christ's crucifixion and death, the transcendent God internalized human suffering. And when that happened, that meant that God, the Trinity, all three persons, could relate to human suffering. And so God suffers when we do. Because God's redemption of humanity sort of took place through suffering in the death and resurrection of Christ, that allows us to look for the potential redemptive possibilities of human suffering. The primary proponent of this idea was Jürgen Moltmann, who said that the suffering of God with the world, the suffering of God from the world, and the suffering of God for the world are the highest forms of His creative love, which desires free fellowship with the world and free response in the world. So I think this is really not a theodicy in the sense that it doesn't make much attempt to explain the nature of evil, but what it says is that it provides solace in the notion that God suffers with us, and that we can find, we have the potential to find sort of redemptive qualities to suffering, as exemplified by Christ's suffering and death. So again, it's called a theodicy, but it's really not a theodicy. But it puts Christ at the center of the question. which I just said.
Why isn't that a theodicy?
Because it doesn't really try to explain sort of the nature of evil. It doesn't say why does evil exist. It just says that there is suffering, and God relates to us through the suffering. So it's not trying to make it will go to one of those 3 points as a philosophical question. It's not trying to sort of bolster the argument.
Doesn't his theology come directly out of the Holocaust?
Yes.
The memory, the German memory. So there's almost, you could imagine some of these German theologians not even having to think about the question of does evil exist or how, it's just a given.
Right.
In that first 20
Yeah.
years or less.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. This is a direct product of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get it.
There are weaknesses, obviously, to this particular theodicy. It's very Christian, first of all, if that's a problem for someone. And some people say, well, does it negate the notion of divine transcendence? If God can suffer, there's a whole debate through the history of Western Christianity about whether God can suffer or God can't suffer. Is it good for God to be able to suffer or not? And that's a question I can't answer. I tend to like the notion myself of a God who can relate to human suffering. That makes me feel good. But there are people who would also argue that a suffering God can't be transcendent, that a suffering God can't be omnipotent, and so we could debate that for millennia about whether it's suffering God. Yeah.
Or is it an either or question? Couldn't it be both and?
Yeah, I guess so.
That there's a transcendent God
Who can suffer
who can suffer.
Who can choose to suffer.
or choose to suffer? Yeah.
And an imminent, yeah.
Because wouldn't that also, by implication, say, if God cannot be transcendent because God suffers, wouldn't that also mean we cannot be transcendent because we suffer?
I think it would.
And I think that could become more clear. I mean,
You all ought to go to seminary. It would be a great class. And then some people
Are they
say,
listening to us too? Are they going to send us some marks?
you've already got your degree, so you're good. And then some people would say that there's a risk of rejection here. Does this kind of notion of suffering, God suffering, is this what we want God to do? Right? Is a transcendent God really capable of doing this sort of thing? So again, back to the question of transcendence. So that is a lot, right? I mean, it's heavy, kind of. This is what I do every Monday from 2 to 5, just by the way. If you'd like to join me, you can, or on the 4th floor. But this is what we talk about. But there are sort of an emerging audience of people, voices, who say that this is not even the right question, right? That particularly in the area of practical theology, this is not, who cares really about these sort of philosophical explanations about evil and where it comes from, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. I want to just give you a few examples of the people that we've talked about. Thomas Long, who was a professor of homiletics at Candler, has written a book about the topic. One of the most interesting things I think he says about sort of the philosophical notion and coming up with a philosophical answer to the question of theodicy is that if you have something that you think you have an answer to this question about theodicy, if you would not be comfortable saying it to a person in their deepest moment of grief, then you should never ever say it, right? Because who wants to hear a philosophical response to suffering, the cause of suffering, when they're really in that moment? That God is now. Professor Long is a Christian, right? And he says that evil is God's enemy. Period. God did not create evil or to allow us choice or to grow our souls. And he advocates for what he calls a theodicy of protest, which is, people sort of raising their fists and saying, this is unjust. God, this is unjust, right? This was a long tradition for this in the Bible, right? In the Psalms, he thinks we've lost use of some of those tactics. So he's one particular voice. John Swinton is another person we've been studying recently. And he puts it more bluntly that suffering and evil are just philosophical problems to be solved, and real human experiences are what matter. The theodicy in its academic form fails to address the practical impact of suffering on actual lives and the meaning people derive from their experiences. And he proposes a series of practices loosely based on redemption, but things like lament and forgiveness and thoughtfulness and just friendship and these nature as a response to suffering or evil as suffering. And then I think we read this book I wasn't in this class, but I think this book was read in this Corinne. Yeah, that's right. Who's just talking, Everything Happens for a Good Reason, Kate Bowler's book, who was if you don't know the story, she is a theological historian at Duke who was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer as a very young woman just after she'd had her first child. And it sort of caused her to think about a lot of these issues. And what's really interesting, I think, in this book is that I can't find any great sort of central theological claim that she comes to, any central theological conclusion that she comes to at all. She just says, she sort of gets to this point in her treatment where she has to continue treatment or she will die, and she's sort of living between life and death. As long as she continues to get the treatment, she will live. But if she stops, she will die. So she characterizes herself as being between life and death, and that causes her to sort of rest in the notion that we just have to be in the now, right? The ultimate cause of her suffering is really not going to give her any answers, and so she just has to live in what she calls ordinary time, which is obviously a nice choice for us as Episcopalians. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm curious on what questions you all have as a result of what we've talked about. Any things that I haven't talked about that you think we should? Yeah.
Would you go back one screen from where you are right there?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm just going to read it to myself.
Okay, sure.
I didn't get it.
Well, I love that that in the class and you've offered to us, is this a valid question? And is it just academic? Yes, in a way, yes. But at the bedside, I remember going as a chaplain, going to see a woman whose baby had just died. It was in a neonatal ward. And she had to have a hysterectomy, and it was a disaster, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so it was 5 a.m. I went back into the room. This all happened at midnight. And I walked in, and I was used to people saying, after the children, saying, why? Now, are they really asking why cognitively, or is it just a response as a human being that cries out from every cell of our bodies? And so I knew that the Thomas Long thing is good. Just shut up, don't sort of say, oh. But this woman looked at me at 5 o'clock in the morning. She looked at me and she said, I started to think, why me? And then I thought, why not me? And right, that sort of keeps it pastoral, practical.
Yeah. She's speaking
Why?
out of her empathy with all the women that suffer the loss of a child.
Why should she be spared if other people aren't?
Just the acknowledgement that we live in a physical body, in a physical world.
Right.
I just, remind myself, God also made the laws of physics. And A happens, B's gonna happen.
That's true.
He made it all.
Yeah.
And so there are consequences for things that don't fit the rules or whatever.
Right.
Which I'm not saying that explains evil. It's all very complicated. And I'm not sure I believe with Beverly. I've had some traumas, but I don't usually say why. I just say, okay, with your help, I'll get through it and I'll be a better person.
Yeah. Dr. Long, I think, would say that there is benefit to considering the question of of theodicy because people in real life do ask these questions. I mean, they sit around, maybe, I don't know if they sit around and ponder it, but they certainly would ask, they would see an event like, a tsunami and say, I thought God loved us, right? How could this possibly? So these are questions that people will ask, and so there is value, there's pastoral value to being able to engage the question. But if you can't give a good answer, don't give a good answer. If you don't know, say you don't know.
Yeah.
Or come up or advocate for some other theory, some other way of responding to suffering, other than to try to convert it into a philosophical question, which really can't ever be answered to anybody's satisfaction. So yeah. I mean, I think a lot of we're about 2/3 of the way through our term, and the latter third of the semester are going to be more about theories that don't attempt to deal with the topic philosophically at all. It's all going to be about, how do we experience joy in life? How do we lament? We've lost the tradition of how to really shake our fists at God and things like that. How do we reclaim those practices as a way of responding to suffering? So I'm anxious to learn about it because none of these really do it for me. You know what I mean? Like I think like most people, I can sort of piece together a hodgepodge of some of these systems, and it kind of makes a little sense to me. But again, at the end of the day, if it doesn't do anything to relieve human suffering or provide solace in a time when a person is really suffering, I think it has relatively little utility outside of the School of Theology, but that's not just in my opinion.
Will you come back and share the last third?
I would love to. I would love to. We're reading those materials now, and the professor who's teaching the class is a clinical psychologist, and a lot of her research is in issues of self-care of clergy. So her expertise is in sort of these. She loves this kind of stuff, right? And she's pretty much let it be known that none of these theories really do it for her either. She's really looking more toward, how can we provide how can we respond in a way that provides people with some solace and that's centered, in a loving God, but doesn't try to just make up philosophical explanations for everything. So
Because we don't know.
we don't.
But
Yeah.
do we have religion because we're trying to figure out why they're suffering?
I mean, I guess that's a good question. I think for some people, the answer to that question would be yes. For some people, the question would be, suffering is endemic to the human existence.
Yeah.
And does it really matter where it comes from?
Does it really matter what?
Where it comes from? Does it matter where it originates?
I don't know.
You
I
know.
don't think so. But
Yeah. I think people do ask that question.
Yeah.
Some people do ask that question. Some people, because of the level of suffering that we see on a day-to-day basis on the planet now, some people want to ascribe a cause of that to somebody, even beyond the person who's actually doing it. We want to say, God, couldn't you prevent the shooting in the Newtown school that killed 23 children? Right? They want to ascribe some sort of responsibility beyond. It's because it's so overwhelming, cosmic almost, that we want to ascribe some blame, some responsibility to somebody. But I'm not convinced that it can be done logically.
And then another good question is, who do we thank for all the good that we have?
Well, that's another good question.
What'd you say?
Who do we thank for all the good that we have?
That's right. We forget about that part.
Is the question of suffering and, why it exists and what we're supposed to do about it, blah, blah, is that one of the bases of the development of a or all religions?
That's.
I mean,
Just said.
yeah, I guess for some people it is. I think some people would say that have different reasons for needing to believe or trying to having a system of something to believe that would explain where they came from. You know what I mean? How the earth came, how the earth came to being,
Okay.
how life came to being.
Okay,
Things of that nature. So I think people have different reasons for why whether they would seek a sort of a faith tradition.
Okay, and evil being one of
That would be one of them, right?
these systems.
Right,
Okay,
right.
if we want an explanation.
Yeah.
Can you or Beverly comment, however briefly, on the fourth bullet, it's out of God's character to swoop in?
Well, Beverly, you want to? Not really.
No.
So long. I think what his position is that when we ask God to do what we think God should do, to kind of swoop in and take care of everything, to swoop in and root out all evil, all sinful acts, all sinful people, who could survive that?
Okay.
If God really if God really descended one day and said, I'm going to eliminate all the evil on the planet, I'm going to eliminate all sinful people from the planet, then none of it, this would be an empty room, right? We'd all be gone.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's his point, is that, it's asking more than God is, it's really asking more than we want God to do. Yeah.
And the other part you've got in there is that the God we know, the Christ triumphant is the Christ who was open to being wounding, and strength is in weakness. It's an opposite side to the idea of the warrior, the mythical warrior swooping in, the way God came into the world in Christ and lived a life that was vulnerable and open and suffered and so on. It's the opposite of this idea of this God that's Superman.
Right.
So Martin still asks,
Yes.
how did God coming in Christ, living, dying, and so on, how is that redeeming suffering or evil? And go on.
And, well, what else is that? I mean, isn't that to teach us on earth how to deal with suffering and try to reduce it as humanly possible? So we're taught a path, we're taught a way to behave that we try to behave, and we can't totally, but that we're taught a way to relieve as much suffering as we can humanly
In the
do.
meantime, they're AK-15s
Oh, sure.
and their planes crashing into buildings. And,
Right.
but the
Yeah.
weapons of destruction have gotten more and more powerful through the centuries. Like you start out with clubbing somebody, and then you get arrows because you can get them at a distance, and it goes on from there.
Well, Scripture says that, God kind of turned things topsy-turvy. And the people of Jesus' time thought it was foolishness, to see this as the power of God.
Right.
But the power of God was manifested in God's love in
Was
Christ.
humbleness.
And the transforming
Yeah.
result of
Right.
that.
And the voluntary nature of it, right? To me, well, that's the message, is that Christ went voluntarily to his death and suffered immensely. That's where the redemptive sort of quality of it comes in. It speaks to the notion of self-emptying love, self-sacrifice as a way of helping others, diminish suffering.
I just think God's sitting in this room smiling at all us human beings trying to figure him out.
Yeah, your ways are not my ways,
Yeah,
says the Lord.
yeah, I mean,
Right.
we're so impotent, at trying to describe God and figure out his motivations, his this, his that. We're just humans.
But I think we were wired to know
Oh
God.
yeah. I mean, I feel God. I'm not saying that, but
But that's one of the interpretations of Job, right? Is that God speaks and says, my ways are not your ways, essentially.
And
I'm
where were you
not
when I
explain
did
myself to
everything
you.
anyway?
Right. Where were you when I corralled the waters, etc.
It's certainly a powerful story.
Yeah, it is a good story.
But I think one of the reasons, I think what's changed my life the most is not the answering of a question, but it is participating and living into that question.
Mm-hmm.
And that it happens just in the inner struggle, it happens in a discussion group, you move a little forward, or something happens in discussion and openness to questions, because there is, ultimately, is there any moral, theological, philosophical question that can be answered in the way that we think there's an answer? But it's something about enlivening our lives, enlarging, I think, us as human beings. So, I don't know if the question is more important than the answer. However, when we have a really hard loss in our lives, a premature death, or everybody's got something here, every part of us as human beings seems to want to understand it, to be able to cope.
Yep.
You know, when you use our brains. But we move through a process. That's the other thing I've thought of. Asking these questions at different times are part of a process that goes on for life. And so if you have an immediate grief, you might ask this question about the nature of God now. But 2 weeks later, that isn't the big issue in living out the loss or tragedy or whatever. It's a process.
One of the, I can't remember, I wish I brought the book and I would tell you, but there was in one of the early chapters that we read, a famous preacher from the mid-20th century was preaching the funeral of his own son. And he made the point in his sermon that...
Bigner, is it?
Maybe.
Anyway.
He made the point in his sermon that what won't make any sense necessarily today, what will not be at all satisfying or make any sense in terms of your suffering today, might make some sense 3 months from now when the acute pain has sort of subsided, right? That there's something that's going to happen in that intervening time. But paradoxical on the other side of it is that sort of a pastoral concern is if you deploy one of these explanations when someone is in the midst of acute suffering, just to say something, right? Just to say, give them something, because we all are in that position. We've all been in that position where someone has had a tragic loss, and we are standing there with a dumb look on our face. We want to say something that's helpful. You deploy one of these sort of ideas, these philosophical ideas, and then a month later or 2 months later, when the primary grief has started to subside, and that person thinks, well, that's BS what that person told me, that from the perspective of a seminarian, a person who's wants to do this work, the lesson to take away from that is that it can be at least as damaging as it is helpful if a month from later that what you said to that person turns out to be BS. Not only has it not helped them, but then it's damaged your relationship, your pastoral relationship with that person. How much more, how can you be of any use to that person moving forward? Yeah.
It's Claypool.
It may be Claypool. That may be right.
I think one of the big things I got out of that Kate Bowler book study is we don't say any of that stuff.
Yeah.
If you can tell somebody you're sorry that they're suffering this loss or this grief or this illness or this whatever, and you want to be with them to help in any way possible. Something like that is comforting,
Right.
but not the pat answers.
Right.
He's in a better place now.
Yeah, we did a whole class on that stuff, right? The kind of stuff that you say to people, they're in a better place, God needed an angel, blah blah blah, whatever. And and Kate Bowler, she makes the point. One of her friends is a physician who just says, I think he's an oncologist actually, a pediatric oncologist, who says the only thing I can say in that moment is, this is really awful. This is really awful, and that's what else can you doesn't have anything else to say.
That's true.
That's the truth.
Absolutely true.
And you understand it.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
Though some people find comfort in there's a purpose.
Yeah, but they can think it themselves, they don't have to have
They
something.
can tell themselves that.
Well, if you're with a bunch of people who feel that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we, one of the things that,
You can't say bullshit, this is
Right.
my way.
no, and Kay makes a good point, because one of the other points we've made is that if someone comes in to sort of conversation with you as a you know, in a pastoral conversation, or just as, you know, a normal conversation on the street, after a suffering, if they come with some preconceived notion about what, you know, why this is happening to them, it's not your job at that point to argue with them and say that, you know, your theodicy is bullshit. You know what I mean? That's not your job either, right? You know, the idea is that they are where they are. Don't contribute worse. Don't make it worse by contributing, you know, ideas that don't make any sense. If that's where they are at that moment, that's okay. We're not going to argue with them. But it may be the case that a month from now or 6 months from now, there's an opportunity to sit down and engage with that person and say, you know, I wanted to see what you're thinking about that is now. You know, has it changed? And they may have more questions as they thought about it more. So, yeah, so that's a good point. It's a very good point.
I think intent is just so important, because I know, and I'm going to choke up, when your mother died, a chaplain came in from the hospital. And this chaplain was nothing like my view of religion or anything. His point of view and his belief system was clearly different than mine, different than yours, probably different than your mother. But his intent was perfect.
Yeah.
And he gave a very rousing prayer, and it was comforting.
Yeah.
And it was appropriate. And it was nothing what I thought. And it was nothing what I thought was happening. And it just wasn't. But she was religious. She was a Christian. And she would have appreciated it. And we appreciated it.
Sure.
Because his body was emanating this love and this care.
Yeah.
And so it's like his words literally didn't matter that much.
Well,
and he
yeah.
was saying words that he meant to be helpful words, and they were normal, they were regular kind of recognizable prayer words. So, you know, it wasn't like he was saying.
I think, and Beverly can speak to this a lot better than I can, because this has been her life's work, but in those moments, what really matters is your presence.
Yeah.
More than anything else. As much as your presence, just being there as a, you know, to put a hand on a hand or a hand on the shoulder, or give a hug, or whatever it is. That's not the time for theology. Nobody wants to hear theology at that moment.
Right.
They just want to know that somebody knows that they're suffering, and that they empathize. I mean, that's what I personally think. And there may become a time, right? Again, there may come a time when they want to talk about, why did this happen, and what's the explanation for it?
Right.
But in that moment, that's not the time to sort of explore our philosophical ideas about suffering, for sure.
And we were asked, would you like this? Would you like for me to say so? So it wasn't like coming in and doing it. It was like, would you like for me? I mean, it was all of that was done just great, you know?
Well, you know, the reverse is true in pastoral settings where, and you've probably seen this, where the most terrible thing can happen, the most tragic thing, like losing a couple of your children in an accident or this and that, and you walk towards the person and said, they'll say, God is in charge. God has a plan. They tell you.
They tell you.
And you know the drunk driver actually killed their children, or you know there's a logical, rational reason. But right then, to hold any sanity or to be able to stay in the world right now, you have to believe that God is in charge of this.
Yeah.
Now, 6 months down the track, they might be grounded enough to be able to say, I am so angry at God, or whatever happens next. But sometimes we hold these completely irrational belief systems to hold it all together.
Yeah.
And we don't need people telling us.
Right, that was the point, yeah.
That no, it wasn't, God didn't call us.
Not the time, right? Yeah.
But, I've done all those things, I think, along the way. But I think your point, Amanda, is if your being and presence is trying to convey God, if you're a chaplain or a priest and or whatever, that there's a lot that we are forgiven for.
Yeah, loving support, I mean, it's,
Say that.
Sophie was saying today, how much your place visit, you just showed up at their house, turned out to be so meaningful for all of them.
Yeah, the power of any of us just showing up, not just priests and chaplains.
So like the Kate Bowler book, it just made me think, I mean, a lot of what she was saying don't do, were platitudes. I mean, they were just kind of empty, trite, religious platitudes.
That are spoken because the person speaking them wants to be more comfortable.
Yeah, but I mean, I think sometimes they're not, you can tell when somebody's giving you a platitude and somebody's giving you that's kind of empty of, I just gotta say something, so that's what I'm saying. Or they say a platitude, but they say it with emotion and caring, and it's just a different message. It's weird, I think, how that happens sometimes. You can say something really stupid to somebody, and I mean, I've done it to somebody, but they knew that I was trying and that I was there.
No,
I was trying to help.
I absolutely agree. I think intent does matter. You know, I think about in my own experience, when my father died very suddenly, you know, my family home was just inundated with people, and inundated with, and this is the thing that I took away from the experience, and inundated with food.
Yeah.
I have never wanted to eat less in my life for a week, right? Than after my father passed away. And my mother didn't eat at all. But I still appreciated the fact that people brought trays of chicken nuggets or whatever it was. Do you know what I mean? Like, I still appreciated the gesture. They were trying to show they cared in the only way that they could was to bring a material sort of something into the house. You know, I appreciated it. You know, I don't know where all that food went, so.
Well, if you got a bunch of people coming to
Yeah,
board with you.
That's true. That's true. That is true.
The other
Good point
people
too.
that come to sympathize with you, you get to eat.
Well,
Thank you.
any other questions? Or I've really enjoyed it.
I have to.
Nice job.
I'll send all of you my teacher's email, and y'all can sell it.
Go write your evaluation